Hi, everyone. This is the first lecture in our lecture series on anatomy and physiology, and this is chapter 1. So at the beginning of each new chapter, you'll find a bulleted list of learning objectives. Those are the things that I hope that you will take away from this lecture. It's always a good idea when you're finished with the lecture to go back and look at those objectives and see if you recall what I talked about with that. And if not, maybe you need to go back and listen to that and read about that a little bit more. All right, so we're going to start out with talking about what anatomy and physiology actually is. So, anatomy and physiology is a branch or field within biology. Anatomy itself is the study of the body's structures and how they relate to one another. I refer to it as the where, it's the location, it's what we do in lab. We're looking at diagrams and drawings and pictures and models, and we are identifying the different structures on those images. Physiology is the study of chemistry and physics and how that works with the body and how it all works to function together to maintain life. So physiology is what we do in lecture. It's the why or how. So physiology is always a lot more challenging than anatomy. Anatomy is very concrete. You can see the model of the liver and you can identify the different lobes of the liver. That's really pretty straightforward. But when we're talking about physiology, physiology is how is it working in a chemical and physiological in way, and that is often not something you can actually visualize. You just have to imagine how that is working. So that's always a bigger challenge for most students. The principle of complementarity. So we need physiology to understand why the anatomy in the body is designed a certain way. So why are the heart and the lungs located next to one another? There's a very specific reason why that is in physiology, and we'll learn about that. We need anatomy to understand how the structure works. So when we look at the hand, for example, why is it you can hold a pencil and a goat can't? Well, it's because you have an opposable thumb and a goat has a hoof. And so we understand or learn to understand what something looks like so we can understand what it does. The body is very organized. All of biology is very organized. We have structural levels of organization, and you're going to want to learn these from the smallest to the largest and the largest to the smallest. So make sure you review this idea several times. The organization of the body is often discussed in terms of 6 distinct levels of increasing complexity, from the smallest chemical building blocks to a unique individual human. We always start out with an atom. We put atoms together and we make molecules. We put molecules together, we make organelles. We put organelles together, we make cells. We put different cells together, we make a tissue. We put the tissues together and we make organs. We put the different organs together and we make organ systems. And we put all of those organ systems together and we make you. So we're going to go through a quick review of the organ systems. What you're going to want to pull out of this is what are the structures that are associated with this particular system, and what are the functions of it. This is a really great place to make some flashcards. So we'll start with the first system that we'll be talking about in a few weeks, and that is the integumentary system. The integumentary system we typically think of as our skin, but it also includes our hair and our nails. And its job is to keep the outside world out and the inside world in. So we say that as encloses internal body structures, but it also is the site of many sensory receptors. So your skin has lots of different receptors to detect uh, uh, factors about the world around you. So things like temperature. So you have temperature receptors in your fingers, and you can tell when you touch something if it's hot or if it's cold. You have pain receptors so that you know if something is hurting you so you can move away from it, all those kinds of things. The second system that we look at in our study of human anatomy and physiology is the skeletal system. And this is going to include, of course, the bones, but also is going to include the cartilage and the joints that are associated with those bones. So the skeletal system's job is to support the body. If you didn't have a skeletal system, you'd be a jellyfish. It's going to enable movement along with the muscular system. You and I have what's called an articulated skeleton, meaning it is not one big solid bone. You have individual bones that are going to meet at what's called a joint or an articulation. And with the help of muscles, we're able to move those bones at that articulation. The muscular system is going to be our skeletal muscles and the tendons that are associated with it. So the skeletal muscles, in this case, are going to be attached to the bones at a tendon. But it also is going to include the other types of muscle that we talk about, cardiac and smooth muscle. So the muscle system is all about movement. So this is what allows you to move around the world. It also is what helps to maintain your body temperature through shivering. The nervous system, of course, is the brain, but it also includes the spinal cord and the peripheral nerves. This is going to detect and process sensory information and activate body responses. The endocrine system is a whole series of organs that are found scattered throughout the entire body. Some of those organs are going to be located in the endocrine system, and then we're going to study them again in the actual system another system that they belong in. The pancreas is a good example of that. The pancreas is considered an endocrine organ because it releases insulin and glucagon, but it's also considered a digestive organ. So we'll study that organ two different times from two different perspectives. So the endocrine system is things like your pituitary gland, your thyroid gland, your pancreas, the adrenal glands, your testes and ovaries. Its function is to secrete hormones, which are chemical messengers, and in doing so, it helps to regulate body processes. The cardiovascular system is a unit that we talk about that will include the blood as well as the heart and the blood vessels. The function of the cardiovascular system is to deliver oxygen and nutrients to the tissues and then take away their wastes. It also helps to equalize the temperature within the body. The lymphatic system. The lymphatic system is organs like the thymus, the lymph nodes, the spleen, and the lymphatic vessels. Every single day, your body, through the process of the blood moving through your body, loses some of the plasma portion of your blood into the tissues, escapes the vessels and goes into the tissues around the vessel, around those vessels, and your lymphatic system has to pick all of that back up and clean that and return it to the circulatory system. We teach lymphatic system in conjunction with the immune system because the other function of the lymphatic system is to defend against pathogens. And so the lymphatic system are the organs that we see associated with that system. And then the immune system are the cells that are actually fighting the battle for us every single day against pathogens. The respiratory system begins with the nose and goes all the way down to the lungs. The function of the respiratory system is to remove the carbon dioxide from the body, and it also delivers oxygen to the blood. Our digestive system. So your digestive tube is a big, long, fancy garden hose that runs through the middle of you. And its job is so it includes things like your stomach, your liver, your gallbladder, the large intestine, small intestine, etc. Its function is to process the food that is going to be used by the body and to remove any waste from any undigested food. Your urinary system. So your urinary system looks like a really simple system because it's really just the kidneys and the bladder and the ureters and the urethra. It's really one of the more complex systems that we talk about. It has a lot of functions. One of those is to control the water balance in the body, and it also removes waste from the blood as well as excrete those wastes. The male reproductive system, so the reproductive system is the entire system. We split that into male and female. So all of the organs associated with the male system, including the epididymis and the testes. This is function of the system is going to be to produce sex hormones and gametes, which are sperm, and deliver those gametes to the female. The female reproductive system is going to include the reproductive organs as well as the mammary glands. The job on this side is going to be to produce sex hormones and gametes, which are going to be eggs, and to support the embryo and fetus until birth and produce milk for the infant. So switching gears, let's talk about things that you have to stay alive. So the functional requirements of life. So the maintenance of life requires organization, metabolism, responsiveness, movement, development, growth, and reproduction. So let's talk about each of these functional requirements individually. Organization, you are made of trillions of cells that are organized in such a way that it maintains distinct internal compartments. So everything's nice and organized inside of you. It's not all in there helter-skelter like you throw socks into a drawer. Metabolism is the sum of all of the chemical processes that happen in the body, not just breaking down, which is what most people think. They just think metabolism means how fast do I burn calories, and that is part of metabolism, but the full definition of metabolism is the sum of all of the chemical reactions that happen. So this is going to include anabolic or building reactions as well as catabolic or breaking down reactions. Both of these processes, anabolism and catabolism, are occurring simultaneously and continuously. Some more functional requirements of life include responsiveness. This is the ability of an organism to adjust to changes in its internal and external environment. You feel cold, so you move inside or you go put on a sweater. But it's also things like the ability of your body to cause the vessels to sink down just a little tiny bit so the blood is not cooling as much as it is when the vessels are up near the surface and you get a little bit warmer. It includes things like shivering when you're cold or sweating when you're hot. Movement, human movement includes not only the actions at the joints of the body, which is what we think about you moving through space, but it also includes the motion of the individual organs and their individual cells. So, for example, red and white blood cells as they move through the bloodstream. The muscle cells and glands are a few other examples. Some more requirements to stay alive. Development. This is all of the changes in the body through a lifetime. So development includes the process of differentiation, which is when the unspecialized cells learn to be their mature type of cell. They get a job and are trained and learn how to do that job. And they perform certain tasks to help maintain the body. Growth is the increase in the body size. Humans grow by increasing the number of existing cells and by increasing the amount of non-cellular material around those cells. So when your kids are growing so fast that you're constantly having to buy new clothes, what they're doing is they're adding cells, right? Reproduction is the formation of new organisms from the parent, because death will come to all complex organisms. Without reproduction, the line of organisms would end. So our next topic we're going to consider is called homeostasis. And so homeostasis is a dynamic state of balance around a set point. Homeo means the same, stasis means to stand still. So literally what homeostasis means is to keep things the same. And that is always the goal because all of the chemical reactions and metabolism that's occurring in your body all of the time is constantly trying to throw things out of balance, and your body is constantly trying to put that back into balance. So you have a set point that is a physiological value, and you have a range around which that can fluctuate. Each physiological condition has a particular set point. So things like your body temperature. So we say the human body temperature is 98.6 Fahrenheit, but some people are a little cooler than that normally, and some people are a little warmer than that normally, right? So there's a little range around which it can fluctuate. Not a big range, usually a really tiny range. Blood pressure is another example of this. Hydration is another example of this. They're all things that have a particular value and we fluctuate around those just a little tiny bit. The normal range is the restricted set of values that is necessary for optimal health and stability. Within the internal environment, there are several set points that might change for various reasons. Blood sugar is an example of that. Your blood sugar changes when you eat and then when you go into non-eating state, or what they call fasting state. Your body temperature might be a little higher when you're exercising and a little less when you're not. Your blood volume, those are things that we call variables. They can change because of external or internal factors. A factor that can cause the changes in that variable is called a stimulus, and the plural of stimulus is stimuli. The process of controlling the variables is called the homeostatic regulatory system, or homeostatic regulation, and involves three parts: the receptor, the control center, and the effector. The receptor is what monitors a physiological value. It examines the internal environment and detects any changes and initiates a response in the form of a signal to make changes that are caused by that stimuli. The control center is what determines the favorable set point to maintain the variable. It receives a signal from the receptor, and it determines if a response is needed, when and where and how. And finally, the effector receives orders from the control center. This performs the response. Typically, the effector is either a muscle or a gland. So let's talk about how that works for just a second. All right. There's two different ways that we can regulate this. We have what's called negative feedback. So negative feedback is actually a good thing. So that's the first thing I want to say about that. People always think negative feedback is going to be a bad thing. And in the case of a regulatory mechanism, negative feedback is actually a good thing. This is the mechanism that reverses a deviation from the set point. Negative feedback maintains the body parameters within a normal range. The maintenance of homeostasis by negative feedback is constant and dynamic, and it aims to stop the effect of the stimulus or oppose it. So let's just say for a second that you get hot. And so you get hot, and so your body temperature goes up and it goes past what is considered the normal range. And immediately what happens is a message is sent to your sweat glands, and they start to produce sweat. And that sweat starts to cool you down. And as it cools down, then you go back into range. So that's what's meant by negative feedback. We're going back to where we were before. All right, so there's the idea of how it works for body temperature regulation. Same thing would be true if you get cold. If you get cold, then your body sends a message, your brain sends a message to your body, to the muscles specifically, and tells them to start moving very, very quickly, which is what we call shivering, right? And so that's one of the things that can change that help to warm you up. Some other examples: body temperature that we just talked about, blood glucose, this is controlled by our endocrine system, blood pressure, which is controlled by our nervous, endocrine, and urinary systems all combined together, and blood pH, which is controlled by the respiratory and urinary system. So negative feedback is always, always, always trying to bring you back into balance, because your body's activities are always throwing it out of balance. Positive feedback is just the opposite. So positive feedback typically is a bad thing. There's a couple of examples in the human body where positive feedback is a good thing, but typically positive feedback, so when an individual goes into a positive feedback loop, it's actually a bad thing because it intensifies that change in the body's physiological condition rather than reversing it. It starts to spiral out of control. So any deviation from the normal range results in more change, and the system moves further away from being in balance or in homeostasis. Positive feedback in the body is normal only when there is a definite endpoint. So there's a couple of good examples of when it is a good thing. Like I said, most of the time it's not a good thing, but childbirth is one example, and the body's response to blood loss. In blood loss, we have to work very, very rapidly to try to get ourselves back into that situation of not losing blood. Positive feedback cycles are detrimental overall to health typically. So here is the example, one of two examples where positive feedback is actually a good thing in the human body, and this one is of childbirth. And so in the case of childbirth, the head of the baby pushes against the cervix because it's time for the baby to be delivered. The nerve impulse from the cervix is going to be transmitted to the brain. The brain is going to receive that message and is going to stimulate the pituitary gland to release a hormone called oxytocin. Oxytocin is going to be delivered into the bloodstream and then carried down to the uterus. And then the oxytocin is going to stimulate the uterus to contract even more and help to push the baby out. So that process is going to keep on. So every single time mom has a contraction, she's going to release more oxytocin, and it's going to cause an even bigger contraction. And that process is going to continue to spiral away from balance until the baby is born, and then it's going to go back into balance. So if homeostasis is disrupted and not restored, severe consequences may result, and we refer to that as homeostatic imbalance. So many of the diseases that we see every single day, like diabetes and high blood pressure, these are the result of the body's inability to restore homeostasis. Our ability to restore homeostasis also reduces as we age. So switching gears, once again, this chapter has a lot of different topics in it. We're going to talk about anatomical position. So standard anatomical position means that the patient is standing upright. They are not lying down. Their feet are shoulder width apart and parallel, and their palms and their toes are pointing forward. So look at the second picture here. Your patient is upright. Their palms are forward, their toes are forward. That is standard anatomical position. This is a reference point. That does not mean that you have to drag your patient out of bed and make them stand up. In your mind, when you're thinking about which direction things are supposed to be, you're thinking about it from the terms of them standing up. That doesn't mean they're actually standing up most of the time. All right, so let's talk about directional terms. So a few things to know about directional terms. It's usually a pair of words that mean the exact opposite of each other, like anterior and posterior that we're about to talk about, the exact opposite. All right. And when we are talking about them, we are assuming our patient is in anatomical position. So they don't have to necessarily be in that, but we have to think about them like they are. And when we're writing about this, we have to give our two endpoints, right? So I'll give you an example here. Anterior means towards the front, right? So if we were use the example, the toes are anterior to the foot. So the toes are in front of the foot. That's correct. But if all I said was the toes are anterior, anterior to what? So you got to name that other endpoint. So our toes are one endpoint and our foot is the other endpoint, right? So we got to always make sure that our sentence makes complete sense when we're looking at it. So anterior means towards the front. Another term for anterior is ventral. Posterior means towards the back or on the back. And another term for it is dorsal. So an example sentence of that would be the popliteus, which is the back of your knee, is posterior to the patella, which is the front of your knee. Two more terms, superior and inferior. Superior means towards the head, and another term for that is cranial. This describes a position above or higher than another body part. The eyes, for example, are superior to the nose. Inferior or caudal describes a position below another body part, right? Or near or towards the tail, which is what caudal means. In humans, we don't have a tail, but we do have a coccyx, which is the remnant of a tail. That's the lowest part of your spinal cord. An example of this would be the pelvis is inferior to the abdomen. So whenever you make these directional statements, make sure it makes sense. Does it make sense? Does my pelvis, is it below my abdomen? Yep, that's right. Lateral and medial. Lateral describes the side or the direction going out to the side. So if we were looking at the hand in anatomical position, the thumb is lateral to the digits. It's out to the side compared to your fingers. Medial describes towards the middle or the direction or in the middle. The sternum is medial to the rib cage. Okay, proximal and distal. The only time we use proximal and distal is when we're describing the relationship between two structures that are related on the limbs, on the arms and the legs. So we don't use proximal and distal any place else on the body, just on the arms and the legs. And what we're doing is we're describing the relationship between two structures based on their nearness or farness from the point of attachment. So when we look at the arms, the point of attachment is the torso, obviously, your armpit. And when we look at your legs, the point of attachment is your hips. Okay? And so when we're talking about these two structures, we're describing them in relationship to that point of attachment. So let's say, for example, we're talking about your elbow and your wrist. All right, your elbow and your wrist. And we're going to use the word proximal because proximal means closer to. The elbow is proximal to the wrist, meaning that the elbow is closer to the point of attachment, the armpit, than my wrist. Is that true? Absolutely, that's true. Now, let's use the word distal. Distal means further away, and let's use those same two body parts, the wrist and the elbow. The wrist is distal to the elbow. The wrist is further away from the point of attachment, which is the armpit, than the elbow. Is that true? Okay. Now I want you to do one with your knee and your ankle using the term proximal. The knee is proximal to the ankle. The knee is closer to the point of attachment, which is the hip, than the ankle. Is that true? Now let's go the reverse. Let's describe knee and ankle using the term distal. The ankle is distal to the knee. The ankle is further away from the point of attachment, which is the hip, than the knee. Is that true? Okay. Superficial and deep, this describes the position closer to the surface of the skin. So think of a superficial flesh wound. That just means a scrape on the skin. The skin is superficial to the bones, right? So the skin is up closer to the surface than the bones are. Deep describes a position further away from the surface. The brain is deep to the skull. All right, so we've been through all of our directional terms. I want you to practice those a little bit so that you can make sentences with those. Now let's talk about regional terms. So the regions of the body have specific terms that helps us to increase our precision. We do all of this language that we do so that we're precise about what we're doing and we don't make mistakes. These terms will serve as a common language for the worker in healthcare to minimize the mistakes of communication. This is the language you are going to use your entire career. So you got to learn all of this. You're no longer going to be able to refer to things as the elbow and the thigh and the belly button and all those kinds of words. You're going to have to use the medical terms. So you want to make sure that you spend some time learning these. And holy cow, here they are, right? So this picture has a lot of terms on it, and there are a lot of terms. A lot of them you probably already know. So you'll just need to brush up on them. This is a wonderful place to do flashcards. Flashcards are really good for this. So I always recommend flashcards. It's an old school technique, but the process of writing out the flashcards and making them is actually part of the learning process. So, go to Walmart and get yourself a stack of index cards, or you can make them out of pieces of paper if that's what you have, post-it notes, whatever, right? And you put the word on one side and the definition on the other, and then just practice these. If you use index cards, you can punch a hole in the corner of each of them and get one of those rings that holds all the cards together, and then you have an automatic set of notes to study from. And so when you're sitting in the line in carpool waiting to pick up your kids from school, you can sit there and run through those whole things without having to try to take your book or this lecture or anything with you. So flashcards are a really convenient way to study anatomy and physiology because there is so much to know. The volume of material is so high. So I highly recommend that you try the flashcard method if you have not tried that in the past. Color coding is also really, really good. A lot of healthcare people are like to do color. So you can do like maybe all of the body regions that are on the front of the body in blue cards and all of the body regions that are on the back of the body in green cards or something like that, because color coding also helps. So these are all the ones that you're going to need to learn. So I've got them all written out for you as well and what they mean. So I'm not going to waste critical time reading through this because, again, a lot of these you know nasal means nose, you know oral means mouth, those kinds of things. Some of them might be new to you, so you want to read through all of these and make sure that you know both the everyday term as well as the anatomical term. Here are the ones that are on the back of the body. Fewer. So hallelujah for that, right? So spend some time learning those body landmarks. Make sure you know all of those regional terms, all that sort of stuff. Let's move on to body planes. A plane is an imaginary two-dimensional surface that passes through the body. There are three common planes that we talk about: the sagittal plane, the frontal or coronal plane, and the transverse or horizontal plane. This is a really great place to talk about one of the issues in anatomy and physiology that can be a little confusing, and that is that there are often multiple names for the same thing. So the example right here is the frontal plane is also known as the coronal plane. Which one do you use? I don't care which one you use. I want you to use whichever one you can remember. That's the most important thing, and the one that you can spell correctly. You need to know all of the terms because at the end of the day, when you're working with other people, they may have learned it one way or another and not know the other terms. So you want to make sure you know all of them. But as far as answering questions on a quiz or a test for me, as long as you answer with one of them that is considered legally correct, it doesn't matter to me which one you use. Okay? So learn them all. Use the one, write down the one you can remember or the one you can spell, because spelling is important in anatomy and physiology as well. All right, so there's our three planes. A section is when we actually make a cut through that plane. So the plane is an imaginary line, and then when we cut through it, we call that a section. So typically these are named according to the plane. So for example, a sagittal plane, if we cut through that, we would get a sagittal section. There is a notable exception to that because there's always an exception in anatomy and physiology. A transverse section. A transverse section is a cut through the transverse plane, and we call that a cross section. So a cross section is a cut through a transverse or horizontal plane. So there's the sagittal plane. Let's talk about it for a couple of minutes here. This divides the body into a right and a left side. So we go down the middle, or the middle-ish area, and we have a right and a left side. If we go directly down the middle and we have equal left and right sides, we call it mid-sagittal or median plane. If we get unequal left and right sides, we call it parasagittal. The frontal or coronal plane is going to give us a front and a back, an anterior and a posterior. So corona in Latin means crown. So that's what we get with a coronal plane. Transverse or horizontal plane is going to give us a top and a bottom, or a superior and an inferior. So in the beginning of the lecture, I mentioned that the inside of the body is all nice and organized. And it keeps that organization by means of membrane sheaths and other structures that separate it into compartments. These body cavities that we produce, body cavities are just empty spaces that we fill up with organs, are what we're going to be talking about now. So we talk about two main body cavities. We talk about the dorsal body cavity, which is on the back of you, and the ventral body cavity, which is on the front. So there's an overview of what we're going to be looking at. Let's talk about the dorsal cavity first. This is going to protect parts of our nervous system. The nervous system is the only system in your body that is fully encased in bone. The central nervous system is, which should tell you something about how significantly important the nervous system is, that it's completely encased in bone. All right, so our dorsal body cavity is going to have two subcavities. We have the cranial cavity, or the cranial vault, which is what holds the brain. That's orange on your picture. And then we have the vertebral cavity, which is where the spinal cord is found, and that is kind of that reddish pink color. Looking at the front side, now move over to the second picture. Let's look at the front side. And we're going to look at the two main cavities that we find on the front side. So all of the ventral body cavities are going to hold our viscera, which is a nice fancy word for all of your internal soft organs on the front side. There's two cavities. They are separated by the diaphragm. The thoracic cavity is everything above the diaphragm. So the diaphragm is right where the purple and the pink meet. There's your diaphragm. So everything above that is considered thoracic body cavity. We're going to have subcavities within that we'll talk about. And everything below that is considered the abdominal pelvic cavity. So the pink and the green. Let's look at that ventral cavity in a little more detail. So we'll talk about the thoracic cavity. It is enclosed by your rib cage. So your rib cage is what creates this around the side. The heart is located in a separate cavity within the middle, close to the middle of this, called the mediastinum. It's the blue area on your picture. The lungs are going to be located in their own little cavities called the pleural cavities. Those are purple. And then the trachea, esophagus, and other organs are going to be located in the superior mediastinum, which is the orange part on your picture. So collectively, that whole thing is called the ventral body cavity, and then it has some subcavities. Below the diaphragm, we have what's called the abdominal pelvic cavity. And so here's going to be one of those places, again, where depending on how someone learned it, or depending on what their field of specialty is, they may keep that whole thing as the abdominal pelvic cavity, or they may separate it into the abdominal and the pelvic cavity. Just depends, right? If you're a gynecologist, you're probably going to separate those two out, abdominal cavity and pelvic cavity. If you're a GP, you're probably just going to call it the abdominal pelvic cavity. All right, so there's two different ways to do that. This is the largest cavity in the body, the abdominal pelvic cavity is. So we have no physical barrier found between the abdominal cavity and the pelvic cavity. There's kind of an imaginary line that you can draw. So if you can put your hands on your hips and you feel that little piece of bone sticking out the front right there, if you can do that on both sides and then draw an imaginary line between those, that's kind of where everything above that is considered abdominal cavity and everything below that is considered pelvic cavity. But there's no structure like there was a diaphragm that separated the thoracic from the abdominal. There's no structure that separates the abdominal from the pelvic. So it's just kind of an imaginary thing. The abdominal cavity is going to contain your stomach, the liver, the spleen, the intestines, and part of the pancreas. All of this is the hot pink color on our picture. The pelvic cavity is going to contain the urinary bladder, the female reproductive organs, and the rectum, which is what's green on your picture. So let's talk a little bit about some of the membranes. We talked about the cavities that we have. Now let's talk about the membranes. So membranes are very thin organs that are covering and lining every part of your body. All right. So serous membranes, the ones we're going to talk about now, are only going to be found in the thoracic and abdominal pelvic cavities. So this is just going to be things that we find on the ventral side. So the serosa, which is another name for the serous membrane, is a double layered membrane with a thin fluid that's found between those two layers. So the serosa is two membranes with a layer of fluid in between. The portion of the membrane that lines the inside of the cavity is called the parietal serosa. The portion of the membrane that actually covers the surface of an organ is called the visceral serosa. And then there's that space that has fluid in between those that helps to reduce the friction as those two layers move against one another and against the walls of the cavity. So here's the illustration that that'll help you understand that. Let's say for a second you take a balloon and I want you to blow that balloon up. And then I want you to take your fist and I want you to punch it into that balloon. So your fist is the heart. The balloon is your serous membrane. the portion of your fist that's touching the balloon, so you can feel with the balloon, that's going to be your visceral pericardium. That's the serosal membrane that's touching the organ itself. In this case, the organ being your hand. The part that's not touching the membrane on the outside is going to be your parietal pericardium. That's going to be lining that cavity that the heart is sitting in, the pericardium. The space in between that has the air is going to be that place where the fluid is. Okay? So I hope that helps a little bit with understanding about this double layered membrane. There are 3 serous cavities, and they each have associated membranes. The pericardium is going to surround the heart in the pericardial cavity. It consists of the parietal pericardium, that's the part that's lining the cavity where the heart is, and the visceral pericardium, that's the part that's covering the heart. The pleura is going to surround the lungs in the pleural cavity. It's going to consist of the parietal pleura, which is the part that's lining the pleural cavity, and the visceral pleura, which is what's covering the organs. The peritoneum is what's going to surround the organs, a lot of the organs, not all of them, but a lot of the organs in the abdominal pelvic cavity. The part that's going to be lining the cavity itself is going to be the parietal peritoneum, and the part that is actually lying on the organs is going to be the visceral peritoneum. You have to give both names. So parietal or visceral, and then the name of the cavity. There are a few organs that are not contained within the peritoneum, and we'll talk about those when we get to digestive system. Those are they're referred to as being retroperitoneal, meaning they're not part of this cavity. They're not part of this membrane enclosed bunch of organs. All right, now we want to talk a little bit about abdominal regions and quadrants. So we're again still looking at that abdominal area. That's a big old area, right? And so there's 2 different ways we can divide that up. The 9 abdominal regions or the 4 abdominal quadrants. A quadrant means 4, all right? These are used to promote clear communication. For instance, the location of abdominal pain or a suspicious mass. So we're going to look at these 2 different ways of doing this. Quadrants is pretty straightforward. Quadrants just means that we use the navel as the intersection point for a horizontal line and a vertical line. So you basically draw a big plus sign on the patient in your mind, imaginary, please don't draw on patients, a big plus sign on the patient's abdominal area. And we're just going to name each of those. So here's a really great place to point out something extremely significant. Rights and lefts are always from the patient's perspective. So when we're talking about a right or a left on something, we're not talking about right or left from your view of it, but from the patient's view of it. All right. So you can see looking at this picture that we're looking at the right upper quadrant, the RUQ. That right upper quadrant is not my right upper quadrant. That's my patient's right upper quadrant. So you have to always think the opposite. Okay. Unless the patient's turned around with their back to you, then it would be the same. Okay, so right upper quadrant, left upper quadrant, right lower quadrant, and left lower quadrant. This is another really important place to point out that when there are abbreviations like RUQ, it's great that you know that, but in this class, I need you to write that out. All right, at least one time. So if you were writing a paragraph about the right upper quadrant, the first time you would write out right upper quadrant, and then you would put RUQ in parentheses, and then you could refer to it as RUQ in other places, because I would know that you knew what RUQ means. So basically, I just say no abbreviations. No abbreviations. I want you to tell me what it means. You can use the abbreviations all day long when you get out in the field, and you will. And you need to know the abbreviation, but you also need to know what the abbreviation means. So make sure that you write those abbreviations out for me in this course. So that's a quadrant. And then the last slide, hurrah, is the abdominal pelvic regions. So this is a much smaller section that we're talking about. In this case, you're going to make a tic-tac-toe board, imaginary tic-tac-toe board, with the navel right in the very middle of the middle square. And then we're going to name each of those regions. So we're going to start up at the right upper corner. And again, this is always from patient's perspective. So that right upper corner is called the right hypochondriac region. So when you're sitting here thinking, hypochondriac, what in the world? Hypo means below. Chondria means cartilage. And the ribs have a whole lot of cartilage. So that's where that name came from. So the right hypochondriac region, moving over to the middle, it's called epigastric, above the stomach. And then the left hypochondriac region. Moving down to the right lumbar region on the right side. So think about where the lumbar region of your back is and kind of roll around to the front. The umbilical region and the left lumbar region. And going down to the next row, the right iliac region. The other term for iliac is inguinal, which is much harder to spell, so I suggest you go with iliac. And I want to point out that iliac is probably the most commonly misspelled word in anatomy. It is I-L-I-A-C. People either want to give it two L's or they want to make it I or some funny thing, but it is I-L-I-A-C. Now we're going to talk about an ileum when we get to the digestive system, and it does have two L's, but the iliac region only has one L, right? So we have the right and left iliac regions, and in the middle we have the hypogastric region. I've also seen that referred to as the pubic region in some textbooks. So if you find an alternative term, as long as it's from a legal textbook, I know most of them, but sometimes one will surprise me. So make sure you get it from a textbook, not off the internet, because people put all kinds of garbage out there. So make sure you're getting it out of a textbook. But if you see an alternative name for something in a textbook, then that's considered a legal name and you can use it. One thing I will also say about names and alternative names is the convention has been to move away from people's names. So a lot of things in the human body were named for the person that discovered them, right? And so as time has gone by, they have named that something that is more descriptive. So to say something like, let me think of a good one. To say something like the Achilles tendon, right? Achilles. So most people know where the Achilles tendon is, but it's not very descriptive about where it's located on the body. So when we say the calcaneal tendon, we go, oh, the calcaneus, that's a heel bone. So you know where it is. So the convention has been to move away from using people's names. Another one is the sphincter of Oddi. So the sphincter of Oddi is the little muscular valve that is allowing fluid to go into the small intestine from the gallbladder and from the pancreas. But sphincter of Oddi tells you nothing, right? So it has a new name. It's called the gastrointestinal some blah blah blah. It has a different name now, which is a whole lot more descriptive about where it is. So I would prefer that you use the more descriptive term. But if all you can remember is the proper term, the name of somebody that discovered it, that's fine too. Just make sure that when you label it that way, that you capitalize the first letter of that name. So if you were saying Achilles tendon, you would capitalize A because that is a proper name and it's someone's name. So one more reason not to use all of those, right? So anyway, that's just something you want to know about when you're labeling things. All right, so that is everything for this first chapter. We're going to move on to the next one, which is everybody's favorite topic, chemistry. Study all of this, use your lab materials. This is the 1 week that the lecture and the lab, or the one chapter that the lecture and the lab are almost identical to one another. They're going to split when we get into, so for instance, we don't have a chemistry lab that we do. We're going to move right on to something else in chemistry. In fact, we're going to move on to microscopes, which we don't have something to a matching part in the lecture. So typically lecture and lab are going to be the same system, but looking at it from two perspectives. Right here in the very beginning, first topic is they're both the same because you're looking at the anatomy and there's not really any physiology at this particular point. We're just looking at where is stuff, which is why in some courses, they skip this in physiology and just cover it in lab and start with chemistry, which is, to me, just is horrible to have to do that to someone who wants to start with chemistry, right? So we're going to look at this twice, and maybe it'll help you get a really, really great grade on your first quiz. All right, so study all this material. Make sure that you've studied the lab as well. You have quizzes over each lecture and chapter and over each lab topic. So make sure you take those as well, and I will see you for the next lecture.